Thanks, guys, for coming to hang out. I appreciate it. So the cloud strikes me as, quite frankly, the buzziest of the buzzwords these days. I'm not really sure if we've got anything that's even buzzier. Now, I know it's eventually going to be replaced because that's just the nature of our industry. And my talk earlier today, that was one of the points I made, that over a long enough period of time, whatever choice you make is going to be wrong. And you'll have to move on to the next thing, you have to learn the next thing, evaluate the next thing. And so I do realize that even as big a deal as the cloud is now, in some time period, I don't know if it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, we'll all be talking about some new hotness. And that's just the nature of our industry. Certainly a lot of this has already gotten to serverless. I'm sure a few of you have played around with that. I know Matt did a talk earlier today about serverless. So there will be something that replaces this. That's natural, I'm fine with that. But regardless of how you feel about the buzzwords or not, the cloud is a focus for a lot of our organizations today. And having come from a large enterprise organization recently, it was very clear to me that in a lot of these organizations, people want to own the cloud, but they don't want to actually own the cloud. And so what I've seen repeatedly in my career is there's a lot of people who want to get it on their resume, they want credit, they want to get the bonus, the promotion for being the deliverer of new technology, but they don't want to actually sit down and solve the problems that come along with it. Because I'm here to tell you, even as someone who's a big believer in the cloud, a big proponent of the cloud, there are real engineering and cultural issues that you are going to have to overcome in your organization to embrace this particular development model. Now, I know a lot of folks in this world seem to think there actually are magic sparkle ponies. I have never seen one, certainly not in any of the development projects I've been a part of. I know a lot of organizations seem to think this is just a technology choice, that all I have to do is pick a platform and all these problems go away. Doesn't quite work that well. I wish it did. That'd be really simple. I wish it was always a technical problem. I know how to solve technical problems. My experience with technology, the harder part is the cultural stuff that goes along with it. So what I'm going to try to do here over the next several minutes is give you guys a sense of some of the pitfalls that come into going to the cloud environment, how to avoid some of them, and how to watch out for the inevitable resume-driven design that seems to crop up in our space. Now, having come from a large organization, I spent a shocking amount of my time just explaining to people what the cloud was. Sometimes this was technical staff, sometimes this was our non-technical business folks. But what was very clear to me after having lots and lots of these conversations is the cloud means a lot of things to a lot of people. And amazingly, a few of them are even right about what the cloud means. A lot of misconceptions, a lot of people don't really understand what's at play, what it means for their organization, what it means for their applications. And part of this, of course, is all the buzzwords that gets thrown around. I would argue one of the most important things we can do as technologists is define them. And I know that seems very prosaic and very boring, but it's stunning what happens when people don't agree on the meanings of words. This is why we came up with things like patterns, so that we could say one or two things and everybody had a common understanding of what that meant. So getting to this common vocabulary is very, very important. One of the big things that I had to struggle with in my last position was getting people to understand the differences between private cloud, public cloud, and hybrid cloud. Amazing to me how much confusion and angst there is around private, public, hybrid, especially the word public. I'm amazed at how many people think, oh, well, we can't use the public cloud because, well, then our data will be on the internet, and we don't want that. Or if we use Amazon Web Services, that means that our data shows up on Amazon.com. They don't seem to understand this distinction, and it's important that we help them get through that and understand the implications for public versus private. Now, a lot of people will then ask the natural question, well, which of these models makes the most sense for me on my project in my situation? Now, there's 3 answers that work for every question we ever get asked in computer science. 42, that's our geek check, another layer of indirection, and of course, my all-time personal favorite, it depends. So when people tell me, should we be public, should we be private, I don't have a default answer to that. We would need to have a conversation. A lot of this boils down to your needs. How do you feel about isolation? If you have a private cloud situation, you are by definition isolated. This is probably on premises, this is in your data center. You're isolated from anybody else. Now you can pay for that on the public cloud providers. It costs more than if you're not isolated. But a lot of what this boils down to is, how does your organization feel about risk? I was at a company that built a data center within the last few years, and I was really surprised that they made that choice. But their version of risk was, we prefer to own this. That just made everybody sleep better at night. Can't really fight that. A lot of organizations, frankly, don't need the geographical dispersion that comes along with public cloud. You guys remember when Amazon East went down, what was it, last year? Somebody fat-fingered basically a command and oops, half the internet went away for an afternoon. You can make an argument that says, why wasn't everybody backed up and why didn't everybody have all sorts of other plans and geographically dispersed over here? For a lot of organizations, you can't really justify that expense because how often does that kind of a thing happen? Probably not often enough to really justify having this duplicated across multiple regions and the cost that goes along with that. Now, a lot of our existing big enterprise organizations already have their own data centers. They have a legacy data center, in which case you might as well reuse that. There's not a whole lot of point in shoving that out the door quite yet. However, it's clear there are an awful lot of workloads that make sense to put into the public cloud once you get over the initial angst of, but what do you mean my data is not going to be in my data center? The moral of the story with anything in technology is it has to make sense for you. It has to make sense for your projects, for your organization. And what inevitably happens when we have these kind of conversations in a company is somebody is going to throw around fear, uncertainty, and doubt as a way of combating what you're trying to do. That's one of the biggest challenges I faced at my last company, was getting people over the FUD of what this cloud thing was all about and what it meant for our applications, for our developers, for our business. The other thing I had to spend a shocking amount of time defining was all the ASA stuff. Isn't that, it's kind of like the new way of defining everything. Everything is as a service. So we got the IaaS, the PaaS, the SaaS, the FaaS. You pretty much put anything in front of AAS and it's probably something in our space. Whenever I'm at a conference like this, I really wish someone would invent bathroom as a service. It'd be really nice if the bathroom could just dynamically resize itself based on the crowds. That would be awesome. One of the things that I've noticed as we've had these conversations is, of course, there's pros and cons to all of the different approaches. I've had some people argue with me that, we have to use IaaS because we already have all this infrastructure and we should just take advantage of that. And look, I've got a script that will set this up really quickly. So that's pretty close to having a full cloud environment, and it's better because I control all of it. Now, personally, my experience, PaaS is a pretty darn good balance in this world. It does limit us in some ways. We don't have unlimited choice. We have a few things to select from, build packs. But it gives us a very nice place to be as a developer. I don't have to worry about all the esoterica that comes along with creating a server and installing the patches and worrying about what versions of everything I have on there. And in response to that, I get the self-healing, the elastic scaling, the ability to deprovision. The deprovisioning to me is one of the biggest benefits of cloud that we never really talk about. I think about how many environments the average organization has spun up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week that are not being touched. If those could go away when you're not using them, for a lot of companies, that would save 7 figures. That's a big deal for our companies. My last company, we had this conversation and we had applications where this was the major driving force to get to cloud, was so they could shut down regions that weren't being used. And then when they needed them for 2 days a month, a week a month, they could spin them back up, use them, and then again shut them down when they were done. I hate reinventing the wheel, and so one of the things I will stress in any of these situations is you should be able to take things from off the shelf, reuse them where appropriate, do not roll your own. I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen in the cloud space, where people decided, hey, we're basically going to create our own version of Cloud Foundry rolled out of all sorts of piecemeal stuff. That's great if that's your job, if that's your business, is to then create and sell that kind of a thing. But if your business is something totally unrelated to that, you may have a hard time justifying that to your business partners. The other thing that becomes very clear in this world is it's going to impact your application architecture. And this does bother some people. They seem to think that they can take their existing workloads as is and just deploy it on the cloud and everything will work perfectly and they get all the advantages of cloud and they never have to touch anything. It's not how it works. There's going to need to be some amount of refactoring that's done here. Again, you're going to get the fear, uncertainty, and doubt thrown at you. Now, the technology aspect of cloud is fascinating, but what's a bigger impact on organizations from my perspective is how it changes the way you think. So moving to the cloud fundamentally shifts the things that you're thinking about as an application developer, and more importantly, it challenges an awful lot of the assumptions that we've had over the years as developers. I've gotten into some knockdown, drag-out arguments with developers on scarcity versus abundance. You think about how we've typically thought about our servers and our infrastructure. For an awful long time, boy, that's a really scarce resource. We need to optimize it. And if we duplicate this jar across 3 different applications, well, that's waste. I've had that argument with 3 or 4 people in the last 6 months. It's like, yeah, there is a slight amount of waste here. However, I get an awful lot of benefit by wasting a few megs of space on the server. So if I start treating this as an abundant resource, it changes the way we think. You may remember back when sort of nuclear power first became a thing, and one of the taglines that came along with it was, power so cheap we won't need to meter it. Same kind of thing here. When you get to the point that instead of this being this scarce resource that we need to protect, it's essentially limitless and abundant, that really changes how we build applications, deploy applications, et cetera. Permanence versus disposability. Sam yesterday in a security talk talked about sort of nuke and pave. And there's a lot of real benefit that comes from being able to say, I'm not certain, I think there might be a problem, let's just blow it away and start over. You think back to when we first started building these kinds of applications, we were the people who physically built the servers our software was running on. We handcrafted these bespoke servers with love and care, and when they got sick, we nursed them back to health. We were very attached to them. We gave them names. It's great. We need to treat our servers like cattle today. If they get sick, that's a bummer, that's too bad. We just need to put it out of its misery and get a new one. Right? And again, that fundamentally changes the way we think about our applications. Stateful versus stateless. If I think back to how much of my career I've spent dealing with issues revolving around state, I sure wish I would have gotten on the stateless bandwagon much earlier. Stunning how many issues revolve just around that. We've all probably had this debate, the monolith versus microservices. Now, I'm actually not that big a fan of everything should be a microservice. This feels like a pretty large anti-pattern to me. There's a lot of organizations that seem hell-bent on turning everything into a microservice without actually asking themselves, do we need the benefits that one gets from microservice? Or would we be better off delivering this as a modular monolith? Monolith has like this negative connotation to it, that it's obviously poorly designed and tightly coupled and whatnot. It doesn't have to be. You can write good code in any language. You can use good patterns in any architectural approach. So we can create a monolith that actually has some of the features of microservices without the tax and the penalties that come along with microservices. Ted talked a bit about this in his previous session. As we move towards this model, it does allow us to be far more polyglot than it did in the past. In the past, we basically had to standardize and say, nope, for economies of scale, everybody's going to deploy on .NET, everybody's going to deploy on Java, and this is going to be the app server you use, and that's the way it's going to have to be for everybody because there's no way for us to justify having all these different environments. Well, now if they're just a build pack, and it makes sense for you to use this particular build pack, and it makes sense for this project to use a totally different build pack, that's fine. We can get away with that. Now, that does open up another interesting question, which is how much leeway do you give people? Do you truly let folks just pick whatever language they want, whatever stack they want, whatever database they want? That might lead to madness, and probably will in most organizations. That's the proverbial juggling chainsaws. A lot of people probably can handle it, but a certain percentage will not, and they will create some major messes that someone like us will have to clean up at some point in the future. Now, in order for this model to work, you have to automate everything. This is a huge shift for a lot of organizations. There's still a lot of companies that have this dedicated ticketing process, and there's weeks, if not months, of lead time, and all this kind of stuff that goes into building software, deploying software. We need to have as many things as possible be automated. Human beings don't do the same thing every time. We're just not good at that. We're not capable of that. That's where robots and computers become really beneficial. If you write a script and you execute that script 100 times, it's going to do the same thing exactly 100 times. If you ask a human to do the same thing 100 times, they will not do that. They are not capable of that. So we need to get as much as possible into the automated space. We have to deal with the fact that so many of these things are now temporary. We may create a service. It may be around for 6 weeks, 6 months, and then it goes away. It gets replaced by a different service. You contrast that with our thinking in the past. We were making these permanent decisions. This is where we're going to live for the next 15 years. We have a couch. This is going to be our couch for the next 10 years. We will not change it. to a model that says, well, you know what, this isn't quite working, I'm going to rewrite it in Scala because I think that'll actually perform better. And it'll solve these other two problems we're having. We get into the wonderful Conway's law versus reverse Conway's law. Turns out in many situations, the easiest thing to do is actually reorg your company as opposed to trying to get people to break out of Conway's law. Our systems will almost inevitably reflect the org chart, the communication channels in our companies. This is one of my all-time favorites. When I think back to how much effort and energy most companies go into preventing failure, the reality is you can't prevent failure. You need to plan for when that failure will happen. This to me is one of the most brilliant things that Netflix has done with the whole Simian Army, Chaos Monkey, et cetera. Imagine the courage that took to propose that the first time that came up. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to randomly pull out plugs in the data center and see what happens. Make sure your application works. I'm going to unleash essentially our own denial of service attack on us to make sure that we respond appropriately. That's amazing. But look at what it's done. It's given them a remarkable ability to be resilient. I can't prevent failure. We just can't. It's going to happen. Bad things will happen. We need to make sure we have planned efficiently for it and that we can then react appropriately. This has been an interesting debate. My last company, we had this conversation for about a year. And when I first sort of broached the subject about a year ago, the reaction was, well, of course we need an app server. We have to. Java EE, have to have an app server. And within 6 months, that attitude had completely flipped to the idea that, wait, no, we don't really need app servers. If you're using an app server, you better have a really good reason why. And when challenged, most of our teams weren't actually using anything specific on the EE side of the app server. And so it's like, why are you paying this licensing cost? Because we've always done it that way. That's not the answer they gave me, but that's really what they were saying. One of the big challenges here is it does mean we're going to have to change our legacy applications. Maybe not as much as you think. I've been amazed at how many folks feel like they have to completely rewrite their application into a cloud-native, microservice, polyglot, poly-persistence thing. It's like, that's not necessarily the right approach for you. In fact, I would argue that the vast majority of our applications are not going to be cloud-native, at least not right away. You can make a pretty strong argument that anything you build today should be cloud-native, but your legacy code is going to be migrated over a period of months, if not years. Now, the closer we can get to that cloud-native nirvana, the better, in terms of really getting all the benefit out of the cloud platforms. But we can still get a significant amount of value just by getting our code into a cloud-ready environment. I mean, some of the things that I noticed at my last organization, huge improvement in developer productivity. I never met a developer that after giving them a couple days to play around with Cloud Foundry, they weren't enthralled. They loved it. Because look, I can spin a space up, I can do a push, and there's my app, and it's running, and it takes seconds, not weeks. That's massive. My biggest appreciation of the cloud environments when I first started playing with them was consistency. I have lost days, weeks, months of my life to, well, that worked on this server, but not on that server. Why not? Well, it turns out the patches were applied in a different order on this server, so that's why it didn't work there. That's a total waste for an organization. And yet we've done that throughout our careers. So the fact that in a cloud environment, what I'm testing as a developer is the same thing that my testers are going to test, is the same thing that my customers are going to sign off on, is the same thing that I'm going to deploy to production. That's huge. I would much rather find these issues out much sooner as well. And that's another huge part of being in this cloud environment. I can get things out to a real environment so much faster, start to find these interesting issues that only happen once we start integrating, and that fundamentally gives me much, much faster developer cycles. And you consider the typical deployment cycle in a lot of organizations, it can be hours, it can be days. You shrink that down to seconds or minutes. That has a massive impact on our ability to try things out, see what happens, try things out, see what happens, get it in front of customers, get feedback, et cetera. Another thing that I really appreciate about the cloud environments is currency impact. This is another thing I've spent far too much of my life dealing with, is currency. And as much as we may care about what version of what server and what operating system we're on, our customers don't. They just want their stuff to work. And so we're spending an awful lot of time, effort, energy moving things from version n-1 to version n. That's another form of waste. I mean, I think about how much of my career we've spent, all right, We got to upgrade the servers, so that's going to be 18 months, and we're going to have to do all this massive planning, and it's going to be this wave, and we're going to do this set of applications, and then inevitably something doesn't go right, and then the schedule pushes out by 6 months. Nobody enjoys these experiences. At least I've never enjoyed it. Maybe your mileage will vary here. Self-service, this is another thing that our developers really, really enjoyed. The fact that they could spin up an environment without having to get somebody else involved. Now, you can do some of this in the IaaS space. I would argue it's easier in the PaaS space. The fact that I can scale my application up or down as necessary, as opposed to our typical approach, which is, what do you think our worst case scenario is? All right, well, let's double that and then add a little extra, and then that's the amount of capacity we need, so let's go ahead and get that set up. We have to do all that projections before we've even started any code, because it takes 6 months to get a server spun up, so we need to do that before we know really anything about our application. That's generally not a recipe for making good decisions. I love auto-healing. My last organization, we had an app that went down, but it self-healed. And so the architect on that team was a little upset. He's like, hey, what's going on? Why'd my app crash? And so we, of course, did the root cause analysis. But as we were doing that, one of my peers pointed out, hey, don't you think this is pretty remarkable? The application crashed, and the customers weren't impacted. They didn't notice. It didn't have any effect on the business. That's really powerful. Now, once you recognize those kind of things, you start to go, wow, this is a really big shift for us. In the past, and on our non-cloud-based stuff, if something like that were to happen, everybody would have noticed, and it would have been a very big deal. There would have been lots and lots of unhappy phone conversations. One of the things that I had to really struggle with in my last company was getting people to understand that cloud-ready is not a binary situation. This is not, a flip a switch kind of a thing. It is a sliding scale. And obviously, the further along on that sort of scale, we can call it 12-factor compliance if you want, the more benefit we get from a cloud deployment. However, we still get benefit even if we're not 100% cloud-native nirvana. Now, the closer we get, the better. That's cool. But it's not a hard and fast requirement the way some people seem to think it is. That's another thing I've had some pretty long, drawn-out arguments with people about. Now, that then leads to a really fascinating question, which is we have this legacy portfolio full of applications. What makes sense to move? What doesn't? What should we move? What shouldn't we move? And that's where we need to actually do a little bit of planning. Now, this can be a painful experience, but it is vital that before we plow headlong down this path, we figure out where the heck we are. Because if we don't know where we currently are, it's really hard to figure out where we're trying to get to. So we have to spend some time assessing our applications. Undoubtedly, some of the apps in your portfolio are going to be fantastic candidates, others not so much. You need to kind of figure that out. There are certain red flags that we looked at in our portfolio. Look for vendor dependencies. An awful lot of vendor stuff is not certified to run in the cloud. So if you have that tight vendor dependency, there's going to be some work done there, or maybe that application you're going to have to punt on. I was amazed at how many of our applications either wrote to the file system or read from the file system. And that, of course, is an issue because that file system might not be there when you come back. We might have to blow that instance away and start up, in which case the file system is not durable. You'd need to write that somewhere else if it needs to be there the next time we talk. A shocking number of Java apps have really, really long startup times. That's because we seem to have this desire to go and cache the entire database in memory for performance. That's great, except if your application takes 15 minutes to start up, your cloud container looks at that and says, well, obviously there's a problem, let me spin up another instance, and it does that ad infinitum until your ops people come in and crash the whole thing because your system never started up. Same thing on the shutdown side. We need these things to go away quickly and gracefully so we can spin them up and spin them down. Surprising number of non-HTTP protocols have snuck their way into many organizations. This can be a real problem in our cloud environments. I guarantee you've got some hard-coded configuration hiding in your system somewhere. What do you do about that? How do you get that out of there? A lot of container-based shared state, applications expecting somebody else will have written something here so that I can use it. I was surprised to see a lot of distributed transactions. That can be very painful because, again, whoever owns that transaction may not be there when the transaction actually completes. So I strongly advise you to evaluate your portfolio, evaluate the applications for how they're doing with 12 factors, how are they doing with these various red flags. Very few of these are binary. It tends to be a sliding scale. So what we're fundamentally trying to figure out here is how far out of alignment are our applications? This is not an easy thing to do. This is not a quick process. You need to have subject matter expertise on the projects. I cannot do a great job of evaluating your applications. I don't know enough about them. It would take me far longer than it would take one of you to evaluate your own app. My sort of best guess here is it's at least a few hours per application with an expert, with a subject matter expert. Depending on the size of your portfolio, I strongly advise you to build a little application to capture all of this data. I can tell you from personal, very painful experience, Excel is not an application platform. When I did this a couple years ago, we did everything inside of Excel. Had I known now what I knew then, I never would have done that. I would have insisted we build a little application, because after we collected all this data, my management team kept asking me SQL questions. Well, how many applications have X, Y, and Z? It's like, I know you think that's just a simple SQL command, but this data is buried in Excel spreadsheets. But for my good friend John, who is an expert at all sorts of crazy Excel macros, I would still be wading through Excel sheets today. Now, interestingly enough, you can use Excel for HDR photography, which is fascinating, but I would strongly recommend you use it for HDR photography well before you try to use this as your platform for figuring out whether your apps are a good candidate to go to the cloud. Now, if you've only got 5 applications, that's a different story. But if you have any decent sized portfolio, you're going to want some way to store all of this information that you're going to be generating. Doing all this assessment work is fundamentally going to bucket your applications up, low, medium, high, red, yellow, green, something like that. So you're going to have good candidates, bad candidates, kind of in the middle candidates, and understand that wherever you draw these lines is going to be arbitrary. And people are going to argue with you about that. It's not the important thing. You just need rough buckets. But you do want to kind of sanity check it. Does this seem to be about right or not? Strongly advise you to consider the life cycle of the application as part of this. Is the application we're talking about strategic? Is this something we're going to continue to invest in over the course of the next 3, 5, 10 years? Or is it going away in the next few months? Now, be very, very cautious with retirement. It's amazing to me how many applications are marked as retired, but nobody knows when it's actually going to be retired. I've run into an awful lot of these in my career. Oh, this application's going away, and you ask when, and it's like, well, sometime in the future. Is that 2 months? Is that 2 years? Is that never? I actually had this conversation with a person I used to work with, and he said, yeah, you know, it's funny you mention that. When I started, the app I'm working on was marked as sunset. That was 25 years ago. I'm still working on that app today. It's amazing how often that happens in organizations. We want to get rid of it, but the business still has a reason to keep it around. So if it's going to be around for a year, 2 years, probably makes sense to move it. If it's going away in a month or two, obviously probably not worth the expense, but you have to do that assessment yourself. Now, once we have these rough buckets, we can actually do some planning. We can try to get a sense of when does it make sense to do this? What are we shooting for? This is another thing you're going to argue about. Do we want everything to be cloud native, or is forklifting enough? If we just get it running, is that close enough? I guarantee your legacy applications are going to require some amount of refactoring, and you can have a really interesting argument over how long that's going to take. In general, to get it running, not nearly as much time as you may think. A couple of weeks, maybe a month at the outside. Of course, ultimately, it depends. I don't know your applications, I don't know your portfolio, I don't know what kind of patterns you've used. You'll gain experience the more of this you do. To help you level set with this, I strongly recommend you do a pilot app or 2 or 3. This will give you a rough feel for what does this translate into in our organization with our applications, with our patterns. You're going to see all sorts of different things. Now, my experience, at least with one organization, 2 to 4 weeks seemed to be about what it took to get a typical Java app, even a .NET app, running in the cloud. Not cloud native, not optimized, certainly not refactored to microservices or anything quite like that, but at least get it up and running effectively and give us at least some of the benefits of being in a cloud environment. You may want to actually have a lab full of people that help you with this. Develop a certain amount of expertise, partner with teams to actually migrate their applications. If you go this route, you should definitely be pairing so that this expertise can grow. You don't want this just to be 2 or 3 people in a room that understand it. You want your whole organization to understand it. Now, at the end of this planning process, you're going to have essentially a roadmap. This is when we think we can move what. Now, once you have a rough sense of what that looks like, we can start to have a conversation about whether or not everybody's happy with that. Some people have interesting incentives to either move faster or move slower. So we need to have a bit of a sanity check there. And one of the big debates that we had in my last company was, does the entire application have to move to the cloud? And the answer to that is pretty unassailably no, it doesn't. There's a lot of portions of applications that make a lot of sense to move to the cloud, and other portions we just can't get there, or at least not now. So we used to refer to these as deployable units. And I hated that phrase, but we couldn't come up with a better one. If you've got a better one, please let me know. I'd love to have a better term here. It became very obvious that some portions of the application would be very easy, very trivial to move to the cloud, and others would be virtually impossible. So move what you can. Watch out for the terminology. The other thing I strongly advise you to do is be incredibly opportunistic about the migrations. Yep, we have an opportunity, let's get that up and running. But you want to have at least a rough sense of when do we think this can move, and then you start sharing that with management, essentially, and get their buy-in. Does this seem about right? And you may be in a situation where your CTO, your CIO, your senior management says, I want to move faster. What's it going to take to move faster? Can we partner with a cloud provider? Can we bring in some consultants? Can we bring in some mentors? What's it going to take to move this faster? Now, I hinted at this earlier, but as I get older, as I do more of this, the more I realize just how important culture is in our organizations. Now, I would love to tell you that cloud is simply a technical problem. As a technologist, I know how to solve technical problems. My computer science background never had anything on solving cultural dilemmas. That would actually be incredibly useful to me in my career, to have a better understanding of how to move culture, shift culture, persuade people, change their minds, etc. Technology is easy. Technology is an easy problem to solve. It's easy to pick a framework, bring in a vendor, bring in a platform. It is much, much harder to change culture. Culture is where good ideas go to die. It is one of the hardest things for us to change in an organization. It can be done. It's very difficult. There was a really interesting Invisibilia podcast earlier this year, I think it was last year, talking about the new norm, how to change norms in an organization. And one of the examples they had was actually oil rig workers. You know, this very masculine, you can't cry, there's no emotions, we're all hard men, and how dangerous that actually is to their culture, and how many people get hurt and die because of that, and the steps they've had to take to make it safe for people to say, you know what, there's a problem here, we need to fix this, people are going to get hurt. In a lot of organizations, as soon as you try to change culture, antibodies get released and people push back. Like, no, I like the culture the way it was. I have a vested interest in the way this culture is. I shaped this culture. I am doing well in this culture, and you're trying to change it on me. So don't be afraid to take a step back and ask yourself, is my culture ready for this? How is my culture going to react to what is a fundamental reimagining of how we do software? One of the most important things you can do in an organization is have conversations with people and get them to understand, hey, this is what's going to change in this new environment. This is what isn't going to change. I did an awful lot of day-in-the-life conversations with people. And so you get all these groups, and when they first see this change, one of the things that's in the back of their head is, am I going to lose my job? Is my job going to change so fundamentally that I'm not going to want to do it anymore? And when you have this conversation and you basically walk through, okay, here's the things that are going to change for you, and here's the things that aren't. For a lot of people, it's like, oh, well, that's not so bad. That's not nearly as big a deal as I thought it was going to be. There's going to be changes in practices. And which ones you adopt, it's up to you. What fits for your organization? Some companies use this as an opportunity to fully embrace pair programming. Others say, hey, we're finally going to get on board with TDD now. Tests for the win. We've only been saying that, what, 20 years? We're finally going to embrace continuous delivery. We're going to look into this whole hypothesis-driven development thing. Maybe we're going to allow our developers to actually get work done by removing interruptions from their days. Maybe instead of having lots and lots of meetings to talk about status and progress, we'll just have one meeting called a stand-up meeting. We'll do it in the morning, let everybody vent, get it over with, and then that's it for the day. Maybe we'll decide we want everybody to be together. Maybe we'll decide we want really strict work hours. Maybe we'll even decide that developers can use whatever technologies they want, provided they can live with it. This is what a lot of companies are doing today. You go ahead, you can use whatever technology you want, but by the way, you're the one that's going to get paged at 3 in the morning, so make a good decision. Now, which of these practices make sense for you and your organization? Depends. Depends on your company, depends on your appetite, depends on what your culture will accept. But you knew that. What's really fascinating as you see companies embrace this is how often the silos finally start getting broken down. And this is such a big change for our companies. I think about how many times in my experience I've had this, well, that's somebody else's job. And I can't help you with that. Even though I know exactly what you need to do, my plan says I can only do A, B, and C, and that's D, I can't help you. It forces people to change these mindsets. You get away from the big bang integration down to, hey, let's do small changes, do them all the time though, and we'll get really good at it. Maybe we'll decide this whole blue-green deployment makes a lot of sense, and we'll invest in getting that up and running. Maybe we'll finally automate so many of these things that have been a manual process for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, and they were never done the same way twice. Maybe as we explore some of these alternative database technologies, we get really comfortable with eventual consistency. I will admit, as a developer, this one still kind of gives me pause. What do we mean by eventual? When is eventual? Are my customers okay with that? Maybe we need to think differently about what an application even is. What does that mean? What does that term mean? If we're getting rid of all the monoliths, maybe all of a sudden application has a much, much finer grained meaning than it had yesterday. And this is obviously true if we go all the way down the path of microservices. So now maybe an application is just a set of deployable units, or maybe we want to call that a distributed system, which is just a collection of apps. Now, ironically enough, this terminology was one of the biggest problems I had at my last company. It was getting people to speak differently about the portfolio because our management had a very vested interest in talking about the portfolio in one way. At the highest level, they said, we have an app called Foo, and that's the way they were used to thinking about it, the Foo app. Well, in reality, the Foo app was at least 13 different deployable things. And by the time we were done moving into the cloud, it was like 70 different deployable things. But that just kind of made the CIO's head explode. So nope, can't talk about it that way. It's just the Foo app. So you have to expect these kinds of challenges, that people are going to get caught up on seemingly trivial things like what we call an application. And one of the hardest things you're going to have to deal with here is changing the culture. And I wish I had a magic recipe for this. I wish I had, just a wand or I could snap my fingers and make it happen. It doesn't. It takes time. And one of the things that became very clear to me is you need to pick your battles. There are some things that matter a lot, and you should absolutely go to bat for them, and there's others that you can let go by. And that's okay. You need to save your ammunition for those battles that really matter. You need to ask yourself, which things make sense in my organization? I know some companies that are very dogmatic about we have the same work hours. We start at 9, we have a meeting that goes from 9 to 9:15, we take lunch at 1 o'clock, lunch is over at 2, and we leave at 6. That might be great if you're 23, 24, 25. If your workforce is all in their mid-30s and above, and they all have families, and they all have hobbies, all of a sudden these strict work hours become very problematic. That would sink me, personally. My son is involved in way too many things for me to be able to adhere to a very rigid 9-to-5 type schedule. The other thing that's abundantly clear is people are not big fans of change. So as soon as you start changing culture, people are going to push back. It's like, whoa, 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 I liked it the way it was. Even if they didn't really like it, it's comfortable. So we need to have a conversation with them. We need to be able to understand, hey, this is the benefits to you. This is where we're all going to be better off when this is done. And as tempting as it is to start fighting, don't. It's much more important that you listen. Take a step back. What are they really concerned about? There's probably some very legitimate issues here. And it's super tempting to just sort of wave your hands and say, oh, don't worry about that, that's not a big deal. It is to that person. So have the conversation, address that issue. As soon as you try to get angry about it, push them around, force them to do something. I said this earlier, but developers are like cats. If you ask a cat to come here, the cat goes in the opposite direction on principle. Developers do the same thing. If I try to order a developer to do something, that generally backfires. If we have a conversation and we help everybody understand why this is the right thing to do, that tends to work out a lot better for all of us. It's hard to get people to change. It's hard to change your habits. Have any of you just laminated your New Year's resolutions so you can reuse them again next year? Saves on time. We don't have to type them up again. It's hard. It's hard to change. There are basically two approaches to getting somebody to change. There's the hammer, and there's the ninja. Now, the best way I can describe the difference here is tell you a story about my boy. He's 10 now, but when he was younger, the daycare center we took him to had a standing rule. Before you release your child into general population, they're supposed to wash their hands. Any of you that has kids knows they're little walking petri dishes. So we'd get there in the morning, I'd say, Everett, please go wash your hands. And any of you that has a 3-year-old knows what happens next. No. So I'd put on my dad hat, I would say it louder, remind him that I'm his father, just in case he wasn't clear on the relationship. Everett, I'm your father, go wash your hands. To which he'd just say, no, never. Now I would start to escalate, because that's sort of my reaction to a lot of things. And my wife would usually step in at this point and say, hey buddy, I bet I can get my hands washed before you can. And she would take one step towards the sink, and he would run over and he'd start washing his hands and say, haha, mommy, I'm gonna beat you. Yes, honey, yes, you are. Now, I'll admit, even at the age of 10, I can still manipulate him this way. I don't know what happens when he realizes that, though. I'm not sure what parenting technique I'm allowed to use once he figures out that, this reverse psychology thing is how we've been parenting him for the last 10 years. The moral of the story, guys, is I cannot force you to change. If you've ever been in a relationship with another human being, you know it's impossible to get them to change. I can nudge you, I can influence you. But one of the most important things we need to keep in mind in any large company is too often we try to force change on people, and we need to understand that change has to happen with people, not to them. It's one of my favorite quotes from Dave. We also need to be patient, and I'm not good at this. This is one of my weaknesses. I want things to happen quickly, get it over with, let's go, go, go. If you want culture to change, you need to be patient. You need to let it run its course. You also need to understand that if you change everything, I guarantee people's heads are going to explode. There is a finite limit to how much change a human being can accept in a given period of time. So please do not change everything at once. Now that said, keep at it, keep pushing, help people understand why this is fundamentally in their best interest. Keep having that conversation about this is what a day in your life looks like now. This is what a day in your life is going to look like in the future. Here's what your current tool set is. Here's what your future tool set is going to look like. That goes a long way towards making people feel comfortable about the change. In my experience, people get there, especially once they understand why this is better for them than the way it used to be. Once they understand the benefits, I've never seen a developer run in the opposite direction. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of one-on-one personal kind of things. I have given an awful lot of Cloud 101 sessions in my career. Totally worth it. Every single one of them was worth it. Another really important part of this is give people an opportunity to play. I've never had a developer once introduced to these cloud environments that says, oh, I don't like it, not for me. Once they start playing with it, they're like, can I have this now? Can I deploy my application there now? Because this is way better than what I have now. It's that kind of grassroots support that's so vital for our success. Now, in the same breath, we need to watch out for the skunkworks teams. It's amazing to me how often a team will go rogue and they go ahead and bring in their own thing, they roll their own thing. And I've often wondered, why do developers do this? When we have something off the shelf, easy for them to use, why would they go write their own? This makes no sense. And that's when I channel my inner Neil Ford, and I'm reminded of a great quote that Neil has, which is simple: meta work is more interesting than work. So yeah, I could build the account page, or I could create my own self-healing, auto-scaling cloud environment using Docker, because Docker is cool, and I put Docker on my resume and life is good. That stuff is going to happen. You need to be ready for it, you need to be prepared for it, and understand that that's going to happen regardless of what you do. All right, so how do we pave the way here? How do we try to make this journey, if not maybe smooth, at least smoother? Now, I would like to tell you again that just picking a technology is all you need to do. Pick a cloud platform and every other decision just sort of falls out naturally and easily. It's not how that works. The most important part of this, what I've spent the last 2 years of my life doing, is helping teams be successful on these platforms, giving them what they need, enabling them to succeed. A pilot application or 2 or 3 is vital to this. You are going to run into all sorts of interesting roadblocks that you didn't anticipate. So using the pilots, we can knock down as many of those as possible. So once we start doing this in mass, those kinds of issues have been solved. So once we've worked through that, we can start to take a step back and say, all right, do we feel pretty good about this? Are there changes we need to make? What kinds of recipes do we want to give our developers so they know when you run into this problem, here's how to solve it? As an architect, I've spent a lot of my time creating little white paper kind of things, little recipes, guides, whatever you want to call them. We've used a bunch of wikis for this as well. Give people information so that when they're doing this, they know where to go. They're not reinventing this out of whole cloth. Had some developers also give experience reports. That's been hugely valuable. This is what we did to move. This is what we experienced. This is what went well. This is what didn't go well. This is what we're seeing now that we're on this environment. This is what we're happy about. I've given more lunch and learn sessions on this topic than I care to count. That's also been incredibly valuable, just getting the information out there, repeating it again and again and again. You can take that all the way up to doing full-on road shows, where you maybe visit various offices and walk people through this. It can be a 1 or 2 day kind of deal. You put on your own little internal conference if you want to take it to that level. Bring in some training. Sometimes that's very, very helpful here. Sometimes just bringing in some people who've done this before, who can help mentor your team, is all it takes to get over these humps. I'm a big believer in transparency. It's important that you be able to talk to people about what applications are moving, why they're moving, what applications aren't moving, why aren't they moving, and make sure that folks feel invested in that they actually feel part of the process, that they have some ownership in the outcome. Now, again, I can't stress this enough. This all takes time. None of this happens overnight. You need to get out ahead of that. And I assure you, you will repeat yourself. This is a feature, not a bug. I learned very early on in this process that I was going to have to say something 3 times before it finally sunk in to the most of my audience. That's okay. It takes time. You need to be patient on this journey. Whether it's a buzzword or not, I don't think is terribly important because the cloud is here. It's part of our world. So we can get into all sorts of interesting debates about what's next, but this is what's in front of us now. We need to be very cautious about RDD, good old resume-driven design. There are potholes here. Hopefully I've shone a light on some of them. Hopefully you can avoid some of them, but I wish you luck on your journey. And thanks for hanging out with me. I will be here the rest of the day if anybody has any questions or comments. Enjoy the rest of the show. Cheers.